One of the ways that's interesting to think about this, I think, is that, well, let's assume that at the outermost limits of your identity, you don't make the assumption that you're involved in an enterprise that's good, nested inside a being that's good. Let's say you take the opposite approach to that. What happens to your behavior? And what I believe I've observed, and I tried to document this particularly in my book, Maps of Meaning, is that you start acting in ways that make everything worse very rapidly.
Yes.
So I had a debate a while back with an antinatalist, David Benatar, and he believes that existence is so rife with suffering, conscious existence is so rife with suffering, that it would be better if it just didn't exist at all. Mm-hmm. So, and Dostoevsky's Ivan makes that case in The Brothers Karamazov brilliantly. He tortures his brother Alyosha, who's the novitiate. And it's a very interesting book because Alyosha is nowhere near the rhetorician that Ivan is, but he is the most admirable character in the book because of the totality of his personality, not because of the brilliance of his rational mind. It's an amazing book in that regard. But the problem I had with Benatar's hypothesis wasn't its axiom, because I think you can make a strong case that there's so much suffering in the world that the question of its validity is a valid question. The problem for me there is that if you do that and you start to act that out, things appear to take a vicious turn very rapidly. You start working against everything that's alive and striving.
Yes.
And
no, quite right. Gosh, there's a lot there. I was thinking of, as you were talking, the Dante's image of Satan at the pit of hell, not in a fiery place, but an icy place. Much, much better symbol of stuck.
Right. Surrounded by the betrayers.
Yeah, just chewing on the three great traitors. But his great wings, he's meant to fly. He's meant to fly up into the presence of God. But all they do is he's beating his wings. And that's our earlier point about he's seeking God. I mean, Satan is seeking God. You have to. That's the way the will functions. But all he's managing to do is make the world around him colder. So as he's beating his wings, he's creating the meteorology of hell, you know? So that's what happens when someone gets really stuck. They are in fact seeking God, and he cries from all six eyes. He's got six eyes and he's weeping and he's drooling from the people he's chewing, and he's stuck and he's making the world colder. It's a beautiful picture of what happens.
It's really useful too for listeners to realize. If you look at, this is my opinion, and you can take it for what it's worth, the images of Satan in Paradise Lost and in Dante's Inferno are unbelievably instructive. If you start to understand that what these thinkers were trying to do was to produce an imaginative representation of evil, and evil as an embodied and transcendent being, and the psychological rationale for that, I believe, and it has something to do with our ability to communicate, which you referred to earlier, is that the evil we do is informed by the entire human race's conception of what constitutes evil. Mm-hmm. And stretching back from the beginning of the time when we began to communicate. So, for example, you see this quite clearly. I read the Columbine killer's notes in quite a bit of detail, and it's saturated with satanic thought. And the reason for that is that sort of thought is part of the culture, because we've come to represent these transcendent figures of evil in poetry and in movies. And it happens all the time in movies with characters, say, like Hannibal Lecter, and in horror movies. And the Milton's Satan, who's often viewed, at least by some, as a revolutionary hero, seems to me to be something like the rational mind. It's what happens to the rational mind when it places its presuppositions in the place of God. Because Satan seems to presume that he can replace the transcendent by his own presuppositions. And I think that's my reading of that, is that's actually what happened on Earth not long after Milton wrote, when these totalitarian states emerged. It's something Solzhenitsyn commented on, where the presuppositions, the utopian presuppositions of man, rationally thought out, were seen as sufficient to represent everything, the totality, to eliminate the need for something transcendent. And the consequence of that was that they produced something that looked an awful lot like hell.
Like hell.
And Dante did that more psychologically. And so Milton, being the great poetic genius that he was, had a poetic sense that that was what was coming down the pipelines.
I wonder if you read your countryman, Charles Taylor, much, the Canadian philosopher, because Catholic too. Taylor said that we in the West, so let's say Western Europe, America, Canada, Australia, we might be the first civilization ever to think you can find real happiness apart from a transcendent reference point. And everyone in human history has felt something like the alluring darkness beyond what I can control and know is necessary. A relationship to that realm is necessary for happiness. We're the first culture ever that said, no, I don't care. I'm indifferent to it. But that does produce versions of hell for sure, because something will take the place of the transcendent point of reference. Well,
it seems useful even from the perspective of humility. I mean, I don't know if this is a reasonable thing to say, but a tyrant who believes in God is likely preferable to one who doesn't, because at least in principle, the tyrant is held accountable by something that isn't him. Whereas the atheistic tyrant, that's right. He would get caught, at least in principle, again, in the operation of his own conscience.
Don't you? I love the fact in the scriptures, they're very unique this way. They do not apotheosize their leaders. And that's very different from so many other ancient cultures where the kings become like gods. And there's the Bible. I mean, the Bible is bluntly honest about its leaders and its kings, even the greatest, even David, murderer, adulterer, Solomon, Saul, the whole realm of them. That's a brilliant insight of the Bible, that all these people are under God and they're under judgment. And that's a liberating idea. And when we lose that, the leaders do become apotheosized.
Well, you saw that in Rome constantly, in ancient Rome. That literally happened. You know, and there's always a proclivity for that to happen. That's the imperial presidency, you know.
Right. And I think it's very important. I always tell when I'm preaching on this subject to Christians, the fact that Jesus is called the Son of God, it was so important because it was dethroning the Roman claim that the emperor was the Weos tuteu. You know, so one of the titles after Julius Caesar is divus. He's divinized. Then his son, Augustus, becomes the son of the God, you know? So when the first evangelists were saying, I've got good news about Jesus, the Son of God, they were saying, right, it's not Caesar. He is not the Son of God. This one whom Caesar killed, by the way, he's the Son of God. But the Bible's always making that move of knocking our own pretensions off their pedestals.
I think that's an amazing observation, actually. And it is one of the things that is extraordinarily striking about the Old Testament, is that it's so sophisticated psychologically, because what's happening there is that the idea of absolute sovereignty is disconnected from the person bearing the sovereignty. And so at the very least, again, speaking psychologically, what you have is the representation of God as that which is sovereign. And now each individual can be a representative of that and can have that operate within them, but they aren't that. And that, well, as I said, at the least, that's a brilliant psychological innovation. And the fact that the biblical characters are they're realistic to the point of Dostoevskian painfulness. You know, Abraham doesn't leave home till he's what, 80? He's
75 or something.
He's a late starter, right? And then his life is just one god-awful catastrophe after another for the first while. It's like, you know, you have some contempt for him, let's say, because he's hanging around his father's tent, and then he does finally pay attention to the call of adventure, to God's voice, and he goes out and encounters tyranny and starvation and corruption, and he makes all sorts of mistakes, and it's easy to be contemptuous, I think, of the biblical characters because of that, but it actually speaks to their intense psychological realism, and it's so useful for people to see that, because Abraham, for example, is blessed by God despite his evident character flaws, and that's the case for the patriarchs in general.
And
so
then for
it is
David,
remarkable.
Right. A descendant of yours I'll put on the throne that will last forever, to David, who was a deeply flawed character. What I find cool is that even before you get to the human characters, go to the very beginning of the Bible and you have a dethroning of the cosmic pretenders to the absolute. So in the creation account, sun, moon, stars, planet, animals, the earth itself, all the things mentioned were worshipped in different contexts. So the author is saying, no, 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 they're not divine. They're creatures. But then he turns it around beautifully. But they have a purpose, which is to give praise to God. So they're not God. They should be dethroned from that. But now they're given the privilege of praising God with their manner of being, led by the conscious creature, human beings, who, and Catholics know this, whoever comes at the end of a liturgical procession is the one that leads the prayer. So Genesis, the opening verses sound like a liturgical procession. First this, then that, evening came, morning followed, then the fourth day. And it's like a steady procession of liturgical actors. The last figure, the human being, is the one now that will lead the chorus of praise. To my mind, it's the master theme of the whole Bible, if you want, is we're rightly constituted when we give praise to God and can lead all of our creaturely brothers and sisters in the right praise of God. Sin is bad praise. It's without fail in the Bible. They went after false gods. They went after the gods of those people. They abandoned the teaching of the Lord. Bad praise leads to the disintegration of the self. So that's now in the psychological order. And that's really
praise is what you praise is what you pursue. And so if you're pursuing the wrong thing, then you're going to fall apart.
Right. One of the great biblical ideas, I think, is you become what you praise. So what gets your worthship, that's the origin of our word there. What's the highest worth for you? You become that. So you become what you worship. We're meant to become children of God. But what happens, we end up worshiping something. So every one of us worships something, and we become conformed to that. And then if it's not God, we disintegrate. And then like Satan, we start beating our wings and making the world around us worse so that the world around us disintegrates. That's the Bible. The Bible tells that story over and over and over again, which is why, from a Catholic perspective, a Christian perspective, that Jesus on the cross is offering the Father right praise on our behalf. And see, now you're getting to the Mass, which is very powerful. The Mass is the great act of praise, where we join ourselves to the sacrifice of the Son, we say,